Hello there, and welcome to On the Case. Today, we saw Russia invade Ukraine, disregarding a nation's sovereign independence. So this video isn't going to cover the invasion as such, but we'll delve into the motivation for it. I also need to declare that I've not had time to finish the script for this presentation, so towards the end it will just be reading. I'll have to read some extracts from Wikipedia, which does provide a reasonable explanation of more recent events. So, to understand what's going on, we need to take a historical view of how we got to this position. And to do that, hang on, figure out that one. That one. Okay. And to do that, to illustrate this, I'm going to use some maps. But note that the borders are not precise because of territorial changes during the period in question. So, okay, so to start off, we have Europe. And we have the Russian Federation. The Russian Empire, excuse me, falling to the October Revolution of Russia in 1917, the Communist Revolution. So the territory of Ukraine became part of the Soviet Union, which which lies on the Black Sea. And that leads out into the Mediterranean through the Bosphorus down here. So during World War II, Nazi Germany began to expand and invade other countries. So it started off with the Anschluss annexation of Austria in 1938, and then Czechoslovakia starting with Sudeten land and a full invasion in 1939. Poland was next, 1 week after the Nazis signed a non-aggression pact with the Soviet Union, and the invasion of Poland marked the declaration of war by the British and the French. Throughout the 1939 and 40, the Nazis invaded most of Western and Northern Europe. And with the assistance of other Axis powers, of Europe, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria, and Italy, they were able to provide. They were able to invade Yugoslavia, Albania, and Greece. In 1941, the Nazis implemented Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of Russia, starting with the Soviet Union states such as Estonia, Latvia, Belarus, and Ukraine. Over subsequent years, the Russians fought back and pushed out the Germany out of Soviet territory, south and west towards Germany, and pushing further and further, ending the war in Europe in 1945. During the Yalta Conference of 1944, Roosevelt, Churchill and Stalin, with the end of the war just a matter of time, discussed how to divide up Europe. Churchill pressed for democratic governments and free elections in Central and Eastern Europe, but Stalin demanded a Soviet sphere of influence as a part of a Soviet national security strategy, with a particular interest in regards to Poland. As a part of that strategy, while Churchill was giving his famous Iron Curtain speech of 1946, the Russians had imposed a communist government administration, creating an Eastern Bloc of nations. It became clear that although the Allied forces had been able to join forces against a common foe, there were drastic ideological differences between the Soviet Union and the West. In short, the enemy of my enemy is not necessarily my friend. And it's important to realise that after World War II, because they didn't want another equivalent of Germany just rushing straight in, Russia has become incredibly paranoid about its borders. So, with the new Cold War ending and emerging from this period, 1949 saw the creation of NATO, the North American Treaty Organization. Founding members started with Belgium. That's the freeing of Europe. So founding members started with Belgium, Denmark, France, Iceland, Italy, Luxembourg, the Netherlands, Norway, Portugal, as well as Canada and the United States. 1952 saw the UK. Sorry. 1952 saw the entry of Greece and Turkey, joined by West Germany in 1955 and Spain in 1982. In addition, the rest of Western Europe, Ireland, Sweden, Norway, Finland, Austria and Switzerland became NATO partners. So not full members, just, they had things in common. So, strategic ideas. One of the core principles of NATO is that if one NATO member is invaded, the other members go to war alongside them. To this end, there are countless military exercises conducted every year in order to coordinate a strategy in the event of war. To counter NATO, the Soviet Union introduced the Warsaw Pact, made up of Albania, Bulgaria, Czechoslovakia, East Germany, Hungary, Poland and Romania, and obviously the Soviet Union itself. So this, following up, so what happened was towards the end of the 80s into the 90s, we saw the end of the Soviet Union, and the first part was the reunification of Germany in 1990, I think it was, maybe in 89. And then the collapse of the Soviet Union, and so all those orange, reds, Eastern Bloc countries, the buffer zone, became independent states, along with a number of other ones. So, and Belarus here is one of the ones that remained, and we also have another one down here, Serbia, but we'll see that in a bit. So. What happened was that and Ukraine being another one that went in became an independent state. So one of the things that happened then was that all those Eastern Bloc ex-Soviet Union states, Russia had no money. So they were sort of found themselves, if they're going to modernize and become, more, have more money and, prosperous, then they needed to lean towards someone else. And that someone was Europe, leading towards the EU. So another element here, so this is the Czechoslovakia splits into the Czech Republic and Slovakia, and then Yugoslavia splits into Bosnia, Herzegovina, Croatia, North Macedonia, Kosovo, Serbia and Slovenia. So what happens is we've got the EU, and like I say, because Russia had no money, they were still, it took them a long time to rebuild themselves. Largely they've made, Russia has become prosperous thanks to gas and oil, and the selling of them. And that's one of the reasons why it is very difficult to challenge Russia, because they're so needed. An example would be with the ending of the space shuttle, the only way to get to the International Space Station was from Russia. And SpaceX, is now able to provide supplies and people up and down from there. So America can now do its own thing, so to speak, even if it's through a commercial enterprise. So, like I say, all these, as a result of this, many of these countries ended up joining Europe. So this is the EU, and to top it off, here we are. We've got NATO again. So these new EU countries from this Eastern Bloc kind of Soviet sphere of influence, many of them have joined NATO as well. So we have Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Czech Republic, Slovenia, Poland, all these countries, Albania, Kosovo, not Kosovo, Croatia, and so on. And we also have Bosnia and Kosovo who want to join. So that kind of leads up to the present. So that kind of leads up to the present day. Now, so now we have to go into the political elements of what happened with Ukraine. So it's Ukrainian politics time now. So in 2002, Leonid Kuchma appointed Yanukovych to the post of Prime Minister following the previous Prime Minister's resignation. Yanukovych began his term as Prime Minister in November 2002, following a 234 vote confirmation in the Rada. But he ate more than he needed, so he managed to get beyond the part. So 2004, there was the Ukrainian election for a president. And to remember here that, Yanukovych had ascended. There wasn't an election to have him, other than within the party or whatever. Effectively, he was put into the post. So he had, he had a good start of he's already in the administration. So the Ukrainian election of 2004 was Viktor Yanukovych versus Viktor Yushchenko. In September 2004, Viktor Yushchenko was poisoned with TCD, the most potent dioxin found in Agent Orange. Suggestions are that was by the Russians, but as with many of these things, it's kind of hard to nail things down sometimes. And of course, we've seen Russia poisoning all sorts of people, particularly anybody who disagrees with Putin. So the initial vote was held on the 31st of October 2004 and saw Yushchenko obtain 39.87% of the vote, ahead of his opponent Yanukovych with 39.32. So it was really tied. So because neither candidate reached the 50% majority required for an outright victory, a second runoff voting was held on the 21st of November 2004. Allegations of voter fraud, including possible interference from Russia and the discrepancy between exit polls and the final tally, prompted Yushchenko and his supporters to refuse to recognise the results. After 13 days of popular protests in Kiev and other Ukrainian cities, it became known as the Orange Revolution. The Supreme Court overturned the results and ordered a revote of the election runoff for the 26th of December. Yushchenko proclaimed a victory for the opposition and declared his confidence that he would be elected with at least 60% of the vote. Viktor Yushchenko did win the revote with 52% of the vote. The next elections for 2010 were mired in accusations of electoral fraud. A joint poll and this is from Wikipedia. A joint poll conducted by Democratic Initiatives and Ukrainian Sociology Service of January 2010 showed that less than 5% of the population polled believed that the presidential election would be fair, with 41.4% believing that the election results would be manipulated and 15.7% being certain that the entire vote would be rigged. According to the same poll, 5.8% of those polled stated that they were ready to sell their votes if the sum suited them, and 1.9% were ready to sell their votes for any presidential candidates. To make this a short story, international observers declared that it was a free and fair election, and the result of the election resulted in Viktor Yanukovych becoming president in February 2010. So then that leads to the Euromaidan protests. So Yanukovych was leaning much more towards Russia, and that wasn't very popular. So we ended up with something called the Euromaidan protest, which is Euro Square. And it was a wave of demonstrations and civil unrest in Ukraine, which began on the night of the 21st of November 2013, with protests in Independence Square in Kiev. The protests were sparked by the Ukrainian government's decision to suspend the signing of the European Union-Ukraine Association Agreement instead of choosing closer ties with Europe and the Eurasian Economic Union. The scope of the protest widened, with calls for the resignation of Viktor Yanukovych and the second Azarov government. The protests were fueled by perception of widespread government corruption, abuse of power, violations of human rights in Ukraine. Transparency International named President Yanukovych the top example of corruption in the world. The situation escalated after violent dispersals of protests on November the 30th, leading to many more protesters joining. The protest led to the Ukrainian Revolution, known as the Revolution of Dignity. Just going to take a drink, excuse me. So, during these Euromaidan protests, there were clashes with police throughout Ukraine, especially at Maidan Central Square in Kiev, which was occupied and barricaded by protesters, along with some administrative buildings, including the Kiev City State Administration. On the 8th of December, the crowd toppled the Lenin statue nearby. Protests and clashes increased in January, and the Ukrainian parliament passed a group of anti-protest laws. Protesters occupied government buildings in many regions of Ukraine. The protests climaxed in mid-February. Riot police advanced towards the square and clashed with protesters, but did not fully occupy it. Police fired live and rubber ammunition at multiple locations in Kiev. There was fierce fighting on the 18th to 20th of February. As a result of these events, the agreement on settlement of the political crisis in Ukraine was signed on the 21st of February by Yanukovych and the leaders of the parliamentary opposition, under the mediation of the European Union and Russian Federation. The signing was witnessed by foreign ministers of Germany and Poland, and Director of the European Department of French Foreign Ministry, Eric Fournier. Vladimir Lukin, representing Russia, refused to sign the agreement. Shortly after the agreement was signed, Yanukovych and other high governments fled the country to Russia. Protests gained control of the presidential administration and Yanukovych's private estate. Afterwards, the parliament removed Yanukovych from office, replaced the government with Alexander Turchenov, and ordered that former Prime Minister Yulia Tymoshenko be released from prison. Events in Kiev were soon followed by the Crimean Crisis, a pro-Russian unrest in eastern Ukraine. Despite the ousting of Yanukovych, the installation of a new government and adoption of the European Union Association Agreements, political provisions, the protests have sustained pressure on government on the government to reject Russian interference in Ukraine. So, gonna jump to. So I'm going to jump to down over here now, because this is an important element to understand. So just going to move over here and make that vertical. So we've got Crimea down here, and we've got the Black Sea Fleet. So so something worth mentioning here is that the east of Ukraine, so this kind of area here, and also in on Crimea, it has a large population of ethnic Russians. This dates back to the days of Stalin, who moved large numbers of Russians to other parts of the Soviet Union with the goal of having a continual footprint in the provinces. As a result of this, we see why there's much more stronger support for Russia in those eastern provinces of Ukraine today. So, to understand what happened in the Ukrainian peninsula of Crimea here, so during the Soviet Union, the port city of Sevastopol, which is here, so this is where the Russian Black Sea Fleet is maintained. And, so Russia doesn't have any warm water ports. So if we look, we can see that, with the exception of St. Petersburg, which gets frozen up in the winter, most of Russia's coast is in the north. And the nearest you've got to something a little bit warmer is like Vladivostok. So and even then, this part here of Japan, that gets that's completely white in the winter, so it gets a lot of snow and so on. So they have no warm water ports. Let's just pull it back here. Now, the only Russian warm water port that they had was, as I mentioned, Sevastopol, which is where the Black Sea Fleet is. So the Black Sea Fleet, this is the Black Sea here, and the only way to get into the Mediterranean and then Suez out elsewhere is right through here, which is the Bosphorus River, right through the middle of Istanbul, a NATO country of Turkey. So and it also explains why Russia got involved in Syria, because if you look at when we had the IS in Islamic State thing a few years ago, why what you've got is dissidents pushing trying to have a part of the Arab Spring thing that happened in Syria. There was a civil war effectively, and the government was losing. They were losing large chunks of Syria to rebels, as they referred to them. But Russia got involved, and it's like, but why did Russia get involved? Well, the primary reason is because back in the old Cold War days, they used to have a seaport in Latakia, and so they managed to get one again. Now, so they were able to they supported the Syrian government, and it has two extra uses as well as the warm water port. The first one is that Syria's military, their air force in particular, is outdated. Most of it is 70s, 80s technology. And so, after the war has been won, if Syria's going to upgrade their military, well, where are they going to get their military stuff? They're going to get it from Russia, which historically they've had done for a long time. In addition, when it comes to military fighting, Russia really doesn't have the same kind of training, the same level of training as much of the rest, as NATO. And the idea between all the exercises, the military exercises that NATO does, is that in the event of a war, rather than have every nation doing every job, they can concert their offensive strategy together rather than individually. So, for example, let's say reconnaissance. Why have every single one of those air forces in NATO having to do their own reconnaissance when they could just have one do the reconnaissance and then, or multiple ones do it in different areas and then bring it all together, So that's a large idea. Well, the Russians didn't have as many exercises by comparison. And like I say, there are constant ones all over the world every year. So it's a constant amount of training. Now, Russia hadn't had any much military activity for a long time, so this gave them air-to-surface training, or rather live weapons training in Syria. So that's the secondary one. But so when we look at so like I say, the reason so it comes to Crimea. So in 2009, the Yushchenko government declared that the lease. I need to say something. So what happened was, because Ukraine was an independent nation, they had an agreement with Russia that the Russians could lease the port area for the Black Sea Fleet. Otherwise, they'd have to leave, basically, because it's a new sovereign nation. And this can be good for Ukraine as well. So what happened was, in 2009, following with the Yushchenko government kind of leaning towards Europe, that the Yushchenko government declared that when the lease expired, it would not be extended and the fleet would have to leave by Sevastopol by 2017. However, with the new administration in 2010 under Yanukovych, he began to lean towards Russia, including signing the Kharkiv Pact on April 2010, a treaty between Russia and Ukraine, whereby the Russian naval fleet facilities in Crimea would be extended beyond 2017 until 2042, so an extra 25 years. In return, Medvedev, who was the Russian president at the time, because what happened was Putin was president and he could only serve for a certain amount of time, and then he became the prime minister. Medvedev took over as president, but he was a bit of a puppet one, and then afterwards Putin took over again. So Medvedev said Russia would offer, in return for an extended lease for the Black Sea Fleet in Sevastopol, Russia would offer Ukraine a discount on its gas bills. He said that Moscow would slash the price Kiev pays for 1,000 cubic meters of Siberian gas at $100, £65, to its current value of 330. To its 2010 rate of 330. So with a 30% discount if the price falls. So it worked. It was good for both parties. Well, the political crisis in Ukraine rapidly engulfed Crimea, where pro-Russian separatist sentiment was strong. When the Russian government was determined to, with the Russian government determined to seize Crimea, specialist Russian military units appeared to have played a central role. In March of 2014, Ukrainians claimed that units of the 18th Motor Rifle Brigade and the 31st Assault Brigade and the 22nd Spetsnaz Brigade were deployed and operating in Crimea instead of the Black Sea Fleet personnel, which violated international agreements signed by Ukraine and Russia. Nevertheless, at minimum, the Black Sea Fleet played a supporting role, including with respect to preventing the departure of Ukrainian naval vessels from Crimea. So they basically took the Russian fleet, the Ukrainian fleet. They stopped them from being able to operate. Other sources suggested that the 810th Naval Infantry Brigade of the fleet was also involved. This is from Wikipedia, by the way. After the 2014 Crimean crisis, the Ukrainian armed forces and the Ukrainian Navy were evicted from their bases and subsequently withdrew from Crimea. So this is, pulled out. Let's just take another drink. Russia then moved to integrate several fleet vessels from the Ukrainian Navy into the Black Sea Fleet. According to sources from the Black Sea Fleet headquarters, inspections of all ships were to be done by the end of 2014. 54 out of 67 ships with the Ukrainian Navy have been transferred to the Black Sea Fleet with St Andrew's flag raised above them. St Andrew's flag is the standard that the Russian Navy fly, the flag. On April the 8th, 2014, an agreement was reached between Russia and Ukraine to return the Ukrainian Navy material to Ukraine proper. The greater proportion of the Ukrainian naval ships and vessels were then returned to Ukraine, but Russia suspended this process after Ukraine did not review its unilaterally declared ceasefire on the 1st of July 2014 in the conflict in the Donbas. So that's this area here. Ooh, excuse me. That's this area here. So the pro-Russian separatists had seized this kind of an area. According to the fleet commander Alexander Vitko, this happened because the vessels were old and, if used by Ukraine, could hurt its own people. From that point, Russia proceeded to consolidate its military positions in Crimea, which it now regards as an integral part of the Russian Federation, though this position is not one supported by most of the international community. Since then, the Russians have increased their strength of both their Black Sea Fleet itself, but also shore-based facilities such as naval air bases and air defences. And so, finally, we have to understand something about the Russian President Vladimir himself. So I'm going to play for you this video from yesterday's Channel 4 News, because it succinctly explains much of the motivation obsession with Ukraine. Not that one. That one.
Now, the centre of the greatest crisis in Europe since the Second World War is, of course, one man, President Vladimir Putin. In an impassioned address to the nation on Monday, he set out in 7,500 rather rambling words his version of this region's history. It is that reading of history which motivates and, he claims, justifies his actions in Ukraine. Today is Defender of the Fatherland Day in Russia, and the man who has claimed that mantle for over 2 decades as president came to pay his respects at Moscow's much-visited Tomb of the Unknown Soldier this morning. The reason why Europe is now on the brink of war is largely because of one man's view of Russian history and his autocratic power to do something about it, alone with the demons that he wants to slay. Vladimir Putin, the former KGB agent, used to like portraying himself as a man of action, in touch with nature, who went after fish, not countries. But Mr. Putin has evolved from this. In later life, he's retreated into a cocoon made of COVID, distrust and faith. He prefers his own company even in church. Take this year's televised midnight mass in Moscow. While the congregation celebrated in the Christ the Saviour Cathedral, Putin was all alone with his maker, looking somber and a little uncomfortable. Vladimir Putin sees the Orthodox Church as the spiritual mantle of Greater Russia, the very reason for its birth. He was the driving force behind the creation of this giant statue at the gates of the Kremlin in 2016. Prince, then Saint Vladimir, his namesake, converted to Orthodox Christianity in 988. This was the foundation of ancient Russia, and he was its first ruler, its first protector of the fatherland. Except it all took place in Kyiv, where there is also a statue of the same saint erected 170 years ago. But here they call him Volodymyr, and they see him as the founder of the Ukrainian nation. His bones and the bones of many of Russia's other great saints are buried in the churches and monasteries of Kyiv. If Vladimir Putin were ever to enter the city as the conqueror, expect him to make a beeline for these places. This is his Temple Mount. In his view, there can be no reconstitution of Great Russia without its inclusion. How do we know that? Because he told us so on Monday on television.
Еще раз подчеркну, что Украина для нас это не просто соседняя страна. Это неотъемлемая часть нашей собственной истории, культуры, духовного пространства.
This was a stream of consciousness version of a 5,000-word essay that he wrote last summer as Putin the Amateur Historian. And there's the rub. Rival versions of the same history. Putin told us again that the breakup of the Soviet Union was a disaster because it allowed Ukraine to break away, diminishing Russia and its historic claim to be a nation anchored in Europe. But that's not how the people of Ukraine see it. They've been defending their right to see the collapse of the Soviet Union as liberation from Moscow's tyranny. That is their version of the past, and they're prepared to pay for it in blood. It is an argument about rival interpretations of history, a clash of myths that threatens to become a clash of armies poised in the snow.
So, as you can see, there's a lot more to it than just, than simple politics and, simple seizure. It's almost as if Putin has an idea of Ukraine as his personal Jerusalem. So you've got effectively two parties fighting for the same turf. And we've seen how well it goes there in that part of the world. So, like I say, I think this kind of gives a very good, what I've given today, gives a reasonable understanding of how it got to this state. And so hopefully that will help you to understand, that it's the old story. In order to understand the present, we have to understand history, and that's where we are. That's how we are when we're today. And of course, Russia historically being paranoid about its borders, and Putin basically saying that Ukraine can't be a part of Europe or. Can't be a part of NATO. He doesn't get to choose that. It's the people of Crimea that get to choose that. But as far as he's concerned, Crimea is his. And from an essay that he gave somewhat recently, as well as a little rant the other day, he has this kind of weird idea that he needs to roll back the map until he has what was there, in the Cold War. So this is dangerous These are dangerous times. And of course, the West are in a real problem because sure, we can give the Ukrainians weapons, but, Russia is effectively saying, well, he literally said, if anybody interferes, and this was kind of a hint towards NATO, if anybody tries to interfere, they will be met by the, strongest response seen in history, or words to that effect. That's a hint about mess with me because I've got nuclear weapons. Many of the Cold War conflicts that happened were ideological ones over communism and capitalism. So we can look at Vietnam and North Korea, the Korean War, and so on, where in a sense, it was like it was a proxy war in a way. There was never an actual live war, and Russia's like basically daring. I've got nuclear weapons. What are you going to do? What are you going to do? Are you going to come after me? Seriously? Is that what you want? Because this is an important thing to realise. Russia knows that their military is not as good. That NATO countries and other countries like like South Korea and China, Australia and so on, these countries have much better trained and much better equipment to be able to propagate a war if they desired to. And Russia knows that it would be beaten, but the reason why it doesn't happen is because the old, mutually assured destruction. So, what are we going to do? Russia has basically, they're holding a very good deck in this poker game. It's like there aren't many options left, and the only, the nearest option is to basically just throw the table up in the air and end up having a fight about it. Well, that's not going to be good for anybody, including Russia, of course. But Ukraine, is just a pawn in the middle of this. NATO weren't prepared to bring Ukraine into NATO while there was a war a little civil war going on in the east part of the country. So what are they going to Ukraine has no expectation of protection. They've got to fight it alone. The best that that NATO members, America, Britain and so on were able to do was to send weapons to protect themselves. But Russia's military is vastly superior in numbers to Ukraine's. It's a no-win scenario, really, the whole thing. So, the best you can do is have sanctions. But when you've got countries like Germany who get like something like 80% of their gas from Russia, all it takes is for Russia to just turn off the tap for that, and Germany is screwed in terms of heating and energy generation. And it kind of, ironically, it goes back to something that happened after 9/11. I watched a number of State of the Unions by George Bush, saying how America needed to be less reliant on foreign oil sources, and he kind of meant the Middle East. This war that's happening now is going to hurt everybody, because the price of oil has just spiked. So watch the petrol stations, watch the fuel price jump through the roof. Because we live in a global, since we have a global economy now, what affects one part of the world will affect everybody else. So there are a lot of dangers, you know. I mean, we have many places where inflation is going through the roof, cost of living has gone up, and that's just, you know, sort of a combination of COVID and financial issues. So what's going to happen? This has almost certainly got the potential to result in a new recession, because we got high inflation, you know, and if you can't use energy, how are you supposed to provide, you know, to drive an economy when factories have to shut because there's not enough energy for them, and so on. So these are dangerous times. It's going to be interesting what happens for the future, but you know, are we going to end up leaving Ukraine to fend for themselves and be conquered? Because, you know, what we're going to do? You know, what is the West going to do? What can they do? You know, make it hard for them to trade? Well, okay. But they can still trade with other countries, you know. They'll just use different ways, different means. So I hope that's helped you understand, you know, some of the issues that has, you know, come to this point. As I said, I'm not going to go into what happened, you know, the events of the war itself, more the leading up to it, and, you know, obviously the consequences of what's going to happen subsequently. So thank you very much for watching. I hope you enjoyed this. If you don't mind, don't forget to thumb up if you enjoyed it, and have a good evening, or enjoy your day tomorrow if you watch this later. Good night.